Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, Fabulites. This is Angela, and you may be able to tell that I am reporting to you live from the Charles Howard Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit. I am just now leaving an event called Black Detroit. It's a people's history of self-determination. It was a conversation between author Herb Boyd, who has published a book called Black Detroit. I'm not sure when it was published, but it seems to be a recent publication. I think that the event was also simulcast, or not, well, yeah, at the same time that it was happening, it was being recorded for Book TV. I don't know if it was being broadcast live on Book TV. Is that CNN? I don't know. And then it was a conversation between Herb Boyd and Dr. Rita Kiki Edozie, who is a PhD. I'm not sure, for some reason I thought that she was Canadian, but I'm not really sure who she is. But, so I got some highlights and some notes. I was a little late because I was finishing up another event. The Charles H. Wright Museum did a screening of I Am Not Your Negro for Cinetopia, which is a film festival that we have here in the Detroit area. So I was a volunteer supervisor for that. I didn't even get to see the movie. But it was, there was kind of a lot going on with that. So by the time I got finished with my paperwork and I guess computer work, whatever I had to get done, I was late for the event. But I do have a couple of highlights and a couple of thoughts. And I'm in the rotunda, and when I did my little test, the acoustics were not great. So we just gonna roll with it and do the best that we can. But, again, I do have a couple of few highlights. The first thing is this issue of black creativity. Now, I encounter a lot of people who are like, oh, so if you go on tours of Detroit, or, there's this whole narrative that's being advanced that there is that artists are coming to Detroit, and that's part of the revitalization of Detroit. And that's always confusing to me because I feel like Detroit is art. Detroit has always been art. Detroit is a hotbed and a mecca of creativity. And I feel like we are constantly producing and sending creatives out into the world, not only, creativity in terms of something like Motown or the jazz movement, but, there's just a lot of creativity that comes from Detroit. You probably need to read the book because he did talk about that, or he mentioned black creativity. He talked about it on the labor front, religious, spiritual, entrepreneurial, cultural, political, and then, of course, the art, including Motown and jazz. And even he spoke about the fact that there's creativity. When you look at 8 Mile, there is a wall that still stands to this day, I believe, that was built, as I understand it, in response to the way that banks used to determine who they lent money to and how they lent money. And what they would do is if a neighborhood was black, they would minimize the amount of money that went to it, and if a neighborhood was white, they would maximize the money that went to it. And they had different systems and different categories in between, but I think that there was definitely red. The red lines represented where the black folks were, and then I guess the green was go for all white, and if you were in the middle it was yellow. I don't know what their system was. I just read an article about it the other day. I didn't memorize it. But anyway, the story that I heard about this wall on 8 Mile is that this white neighborhood was too close to this black neighborhood, and so in order to protect their property values and protect themselves from, I guess just the awfulness of blackness, they built this wall. And I think it's like a 6-foot wall, 8-foot wall. It's a concrete wall, and it's a long wall. But he talked about even the creativity in terms of when you look at how that wall was decorated and adorned by black folks, you can see, the creativity of black Detroit. He mentioned something about Russell Street. I don't know anything about that. He talked about Detroit being a hotbed for black activism and a forerunner for the civil rights movement. He mentioned Dr. Ocean Sweet, who moved into Garland. And I'm working on a play right now, sort of kind of, with Dorothy Robinson. Anybody in Detroit, if you don't know Dorothy Robinson, she's one of our black historical playwrights here. But the opening scene is Dr. Ocean Sweet. He's moved into his house. A white mob comes, and they're like, get out. We don't care if you're a doctor. Go to your own black neighborhood. We don't want you over here on Garland Street. And then they're like, oh, shoot, they armed. They shooting back. And that's all I know really of the story. I think I watched one video, but I haven't done any hot, intense research. But this idea that, in 1925, there was this white mob that encountered an armed black man. And this was dealing with the restrictive covenants. Detroit had them. I believe Chicago had them. Philly might have had them. But throughout the country, there were real estate rules that I don't want to say guided or directed, but that allowed certain people to live certain places and other people to live other places, and black people were not allowed to live in certain communities based on these restrictive covenants. And then he mentioned, which I did not know, that Coleman Young worked with the Sweet family. When he was 7 or 8 years old, Coleman Young worked with the Sweet family. So one of the things that he said, he talks about past this prologue, and it's so interesting when you think about the people and the types of people that you encounter and the types of situations that you encounter and how they shape you and influence you. So when you think of a Coleman Young who was mayor of Detroit for 20 years and is well respected in some quarters and he's hated in other quarters, usually the people that I know who are black and progressive respect and admire Coleman Young and the work that he did. I don't think that anybody thinks that he's perfect because he was a human being. And then it seems like there's a lot of hostility that I noticed coming from certain types of white people. I don't know if you can type people, but I've definitely noticed that. But he was definitely a pioneer, and he was definitely an amazing person. Coleman Young was a Tuskegee Airman. He was in the labor movement at Ford. Somehow he got kicked out of Ford because somebody tried to lay hands on him, and he laid hands right back. He was involved. He was a trade unionist. He was involved with TULC, and I'm not sure what that was. In 1964, he was elected as a state senator, and Herb Boyd told a story where somebody called him an MF, Coleman Young an MF, and Coleman Young said, you better call me Senator MF or something like that. Okay. So talked about, again, Detroit is a hotbed for black activism and a forerunner for civil rights. And just, the leadership and the thought and the creativity that you see and that you feel and you experience when you're in Detroit. I've lived in New York, I've lived in Toronto, I've lived in Mississippi, and I've traveled all over the world. And I really just feel like there is no place like Detroit. When you are around progressive black Detroiters, it's like there's nobody else in the world is like that. Sometimes it gets frustrating being out here with these other folks because I'm from Detroit. Okay. I just lost. Did I lose it? Let me come back in. I hit something. So that I'm kind of winding down. He talked about black pioneers and black visionaries in Detroit. He talked about the Blackburn Affair, the abolitionist movement, Great Migration, and the military. Detroit stress in the context of someone asked him a question about Detroit stress, STRESS, which seemed to be some cops who were out of control. I think a lot of the police brutality that happened in Detroit had to do with stress. And there were some black folks who were involved with stress who, I guess they took great pride in showing that they were more blue than black. Boo. But he talks about stress, and I think that that's covered in the book as well. And stress being a carryover from the plantation days. The woman asked about racialized police brutality. Just kind of breaking people up from unlawfully gathering. Oh, it's too many Negroes in one place. We need to break that up. So let's send in 3, 4, 5 cops to break it up. I think that kind of I think that kind of captures the gist of the event. The book, again, is called Black Detroit. It's by Herb Boyd. I'm assuming that you can purchase it online someplace. But again, if I didn't already say this, he ended by talking about the fact that past is prologue and about the power of the self-determination that we see in Black Detroit. So that's what I got, Fabulites. Thank you so much again for being with me. Thank you for being you and being fabulous and being fabulous you. Peace.